part of it is that last weekend, hundreds of delegates from around the country, including from Norwich and across Norfolk, attended the Socialist Workers' Party annual conference, which is always held in January and is the sovereign decision-making body of our organisation, which also elects the leadership bodies and has debates and arguments and so on. And the first thing to say is I think it was a successful conference. That might sound like a curious thing to say, but when we had to hold that conference online for the first time, and we're not just talking an hour, Zoom, 2 hours, we're talking over a whole weekend, this can't be taken for granted. And I think it was a very successful conference, both because we, with relatively few hitches, did it online. I think there was still an enormous amount of time for debate and discussion and contributions, but also I think it succeeded in recognizing and analysing the scale of the challenges and the attacks on working class people we face, of trying to draw out what the SWP's response, what its campaigning priorities, its sense of direction for its local branches and nationally. And also, perhaps we touch on this again, I thought it also ably demonstrated that the SWP has been able to attract a new layer of excellent comrades who are bringing new experience, new confidence, sometimes from the Labour Party, people who inspired by Corbyn now reassessing and looking around for a new political home and being attracted to the SWP, people coming out of the Black Lives Matter movement and so on. And I think that was an important sign. We have to think about how we build on it. So let me just turn to the bigger picture. Firstly, and I'm going to touch on quite a number of themes, and perhaps not always with the depth that one would like. So people should ask questions and take up questions, or if there's specific questions about the conference, myself or perhaps other delegates might be able to answer those. But I think that firstly, something we've talked about throughout the year, which we touched again on that conference, the sheer scale of global instability, of upheaval, of polarization to the left and to the right that's happening again and again, and has been intensified. It didn't start with the pandemic. Years and decades of neoliberal attacks on working class people, the beginnings of what we call the global revolt of protests from everywhere from Ecuador to Iraq that we saw before the pandemic, but then intensified by the ravages of this horrible pandemic, with the response of governments and employers that again and again prioritize profit over people, has been devastating. The Johns Hopkins University in the United States, that tries to keep a track globally, estimates that 92 million cases of COVID have been reported. That's surely a huge underestimate of the reality. And nearly 2 million deaths. And for all the promises of the vaccine and that glimpse of hope, at the minute we seem to be in possibly the darkest hour with the vaccine. And that's intensified all the inequalities and horrors of the capitalist system. And to underline that polarization, we saw a graphically last week where we saw the mobilization by Trump himself of his supporters to invade and ransack the US Capitol to help split the Republican Party, to mobilize further his supporters around this narrative that the election was stolen, to say that the incoming Biden administration... Can you hear me okay? Okay, I'm going to carry on unless someone says anything. And that what's quite clear is that the legacy of Trump, either with Trump's continuing presence or not, is going to be an emboldened and increasingly developed mass far-right street movement with organized fascists. Think of the fascist militias like the Proud Boys and the Three Percenters and the Oath Keepers and so on and so forth, that are at the heart of those movements and are seeking to grow and to crystallize into a serious fascist movement in the United States. That's one side of the polarization sharply underlying it. But let's not forget, it's not simply to the right, both because we've also seen even during the pandemic, explosions of mass struggles from below. You think about what's happened in places like Belarus or Chile this year, that continuing pattern of eruptions of mass protests from below in society, but also specific mass movements that have struck real blows against the far right. You think about Poland, where there's been a far right government that's been willing to mobilize alongside fascists on the streets at some points, where further round of attacks on abortion rights threw up in the autumn a massive movement led by mainly young women, but also including large numbers of men, right deep into small town Poland, that's thrown the regime and the Catholic Church right onto the defensive in Poland. Or if you think about in Greece, where a mass anti-fascist movement, Kiefer, an anti-fascist coalition that our comrades in Greece are.
Like to hear you.
Can you hear me? Because someone keeps speaking. Is there a problem with the connection? Can someone just let me?
No, your connection's fine. It's just when people dial in on their phones, they're not automatically muted.
Okay, I'm going to, unless I see it. If there's a problem, chat message, Wendy, otherwise I'll just plough on. Look, in Greece, a mass anti-fascist movement smashed the Nazis of Golden Dawn, who once had 18 MPs. So the point is that polarisation is to the right, but it's also to the left. That's key for us to understanding. Now, of course, we're here in Britain. I think that the points I just want to make about first of all, about the Tory government is a year ago, and it was a depressing moment, of course. We saw Boris Johnson elected with actually what was the biggest majority for the Tory party in Parliament since 1992. But the criminal failures of the government, and I think reinforced by the way in which Britain, as one of the pioneers of neoliberalism, that's gone some of the ways the furthest of outsourcing, privatization, the worship of private entrepreneurs as solutions to all public problems, has weakened the ability of the state to cope with, after all, probably the biggest public health crisis that we've seen in the last century in this country. People might have seen the reports about the cost of this today. Now hitting 100,000, a horrible development. That if you look at the number of people that have died compared to the overall size of the population, Britain is not only the worst in Europe, but is worse than America. It's maybe 1 in every 660 people has died. A horrible human cost, utterly unnecessary because of the way that the government, the toxic interaction between our government's failures and neoliberalism. I saw one report today that suggested that the last year, 2020, was the deadliest, had the highest level of deaths in England and Wales for more than a century. This is criminal. And I think it politically, the one fact I want to emphasize is I think this has created a situation where, despite its majority, this is a weak government. I mean, how many U-turns have we seen from the A-levels in the summer to the sudden announcement to extend the furlough scheme, to retreat after retreat over free school meals, another one today, and over schools themselves, faced with the revolt in the schools that took place as they're supposed to reopen. Johnson could go from one day saying schools are safe and they're going to open to the next day announcing that they're only going to be open to key workers, children and vulnerable children again, effectively again, a partial closure of the schools. It's a weak government that has managed to have the highest death rate in Europe and the biggest hit to economic output. I mean, it's thought it has a trade-off between the two. It's actually managed to get the absolute worst of both worlds. And, by the way, just as an aside, it may have avoided the no deal Brexit, but I think the whole Brexit project is not one that's had broad base of support amongst capital. And I think the disastrous handling of COVID, and the whole handling of Brexit has made much of the British ruling class also sceptical about Johnson's government, which I think reinforces its vulnerability. And one of the reasons why this matters is I think that one of the problems we face is that so much of the trade union leadership is so pessimistic. It kind of believes you can't really beat the government and that the members won't fight. And that pessimism is also then reinforced by an outlook of social partnership, that you have to work with employers, businesses have to be viable, they have to be profitable to provide jobs. They don't always say this explicitly, but it's again and again you pick up this kind of acceptance which blunts resistance to the attacks we're seeing over jobs and pay and conditions. And it merges into a kind of language of national unity, which we have to constantly seek to challenge. And that's a huge problem. And we're not seeing anything like the fight back that we all think is possible or would like to see or is required. Nevertheless, I think, and we talked about this at the conference over the weekend, we have seen some potential. And it's important to point to that potential as examples of resistance to, again, make the argument that it is possible to fight back and we need more of it. We saw a whole wave of resistance right back in March, late March, pushing from below to enforce the lockdown, walkouts at libraries that didn't involve ballots, just sometimes involved the famous Section 44 about the right not to work in unsafe workplace, sometimes not even bothering that, just leaving workplaces. And we saw a whole series of these kind of COVID strikes. We've seen strikes at places like Tower Hamlets Council in East London, at SOAS University over, the threatened strike that saw the forced withdrawal of compulsory redundancies. And, one of our tasks as socialists is not just to look for opportunities to lead if we're in workplaces where it's possible to lead these kind of fight backs, but also to spread and build solidarity with this, but also to spread the word, to say, look, it is possible, and to give people more confidence. In the schools, I think we've really seen three waves. In late March, where the union, I remember a tweet by Kevin Courtney, one of the joint general secretaries of the National Education Union, saying, really a message to reps and activists saying, defy your head if they're not removing vulnerable staff from school and get them working from home and stand up to your head. And no talk of ballots or anything like that. I think on a more significant scale, on a bigger scale, around the Johnson's attempt to the wider reopening of schools on June the 1st, when again we remember that 20,000 Zoom call. We were all very impressed by that number. We've seen even bigger numbers now on an NEU national call. And really damaging Johnson's and delaying Johnson's plans to reopen schools and stymieing his plans to fully reopen schools before the summer holidays. These may have been temporary moments when the union fought, but nonetheless, it's had a huge impact and unleashed a big potential. And again, we've seen this over New Year when the NEU, I think partly under pressure from below and from initiatives that our comrades were involved in, particularly in London, to call a mass Zoom meeting in London over the school holidays, itself quite a remarkable development. And the union calling it, because it had a cap on how many people it can have on a Zoom call. It had 20,000 on Zoom, but it had 50, 60,000 watching on YouTube and Facebook, and quite helpful because a few of us could watch it. To very, very impressive meeting, emboldening the membership to use Section 44, and a huge wave of agitation took place in the schools. And that's when suddenly Johnson was forced to retreat. There's a rearguard action being taken place by the Tories. They want to keep nurseries open. There's big issues around special schools. They're diluting the definition of vulnerable or key worker status and so on. And there are battles, and there have been more battles and more successes in a whole number of places pushing that project back. But nonetheless, it gives us a glimpse of the potential to fight. We also saw, let's recall over the summer, as the crisis on the NHS eased at that moment, we saw an explosion around pay, often led by a layer of new activists, shaped by the horrors on the COVID wards, bitter against the government, leading a significant wave of demonstrations and so on, then hitting the kind of conservative inertia of much of the health unions. My personal, I wouldn't be surprised, and I think we have to try and hasten this and indeed possibly initiate it, that this will re-emerge when this wave of the crisis passes in the NHS, and we have to think how we go further next time. And I think one of the things we've identified is there is a whole layer of people in the workplace, in the unions, who want to see much bigger fight back. I mean, people may have seen, depends how closely you follow these things, but in the General Secretary election to replace Dave Prentice in Unison, which has 1.4 million members, the biggest union in Britain currently, that Paul Holmes, the left candidate that we were also supporting, it was a very good campaign, and it connected. And Paul Holmes came second, the most successful left candidate in decades, with a third of the vote. And that's something we can build on to try to get a bigger, more confident left that can connect with a much wider layer of people who want to see a very different response from their unions. And therefore, one of the lessons I take from all of this is that we have to think about initiatives. We are not powerless. We have to, obviously, different workplaces, different unions, we have different weights, there's different places and so on. We have to think about how we can push the arguments and where possible trying to lead some struggles. Secondly, we have to make the argument that the lesson of what happens in schools has to be that other unions have to fight, over safety. There's a big outbreak of COVID, it looks like in the Ford Halewood plant. There's huge issues there, but also around the huge attacks that are taking place on jobs. Between February and November, 820,000 jobs were shed from payrolls. If it wasn't for the furlough scheme, this would be much, much worse. The furlough scheme is supposed to be withdrawn now in April. There was a huge fight there. There's big questions around pay. There's a public sector pay freeze. In other words, the Tories moving to shift the burden of the crisis onto working class people. And there has to be a much bigger fight. And an aspect of that is that's incredibly important, as a big theme of the conference, is that the People Before Profit initiative, which the Socialist Workers' Party is involved with other forces, we've identified that there is an audience of people who want to see a fight back. We want to have a pole of attraction to help pull those people together, especially when we have the atomization of often people working at home and online and so on. We have to pull people together to give people confidence, to clarify ideas, to build solidarity with disputes like the fight over jobs from Rolls-Royce up in Burnley and Barnoldswick, to share those experiences. But also People for Profit has put forward an emergency programme for job safety and services that in many ways is a kind of alternative to that social partnership outlook that often bedevils the trade union leaderships, to clearly say through a series of concrete demands that it should be the bosses, not working class people, that pay for the crisis. We want to draw people around this. And I think one of our tasks, as well as nationally, there was a fantastic meeting, I got it last week, Times moves on, which we had Kevin Courtney and Howard Beckett from Unite, but also rank and file strikers, people organising in care homes and so on, talking about that resistance. We have to keep to deepen. We had a very successful launch in East Anglia. We have to keep on thinking about what trade unionists can we draw into it, what people around the Labour Party, what people in housing campaigns, young workers who may not even be in unions, how we can reach out and pull the biggest layers of people to talk about how we can resist. That's often, we've been able to combine that with physical protests. That's getting harder at the minute, but we have to sometimes be creative, and there will be opportunities down the road. And one key date for people is the 24th of January, when there's a national activist meeting with workshops, the participation and opportunity to share experiences and think how we rearm the movement with the challenges ahead, but also with the recognition that the rebellion that we saw in the schools gives us a glimpse of our potential power and how can we generalize and draw on those lessons. Secondly, and this is again a big theme of the conference, the polarization in society. We've seen both sides of that explicitly around racism, the ramping up of racist attacks on refugees trying to come over from Calais, from Priti Patel, the ramping up of Islamophobia. All of these questions are not going to, the Tories are going to constantly seek the blame game to scapegoating, and that always means ramping up of racism. We've also seen a most magnificent anti-racist movement in the summer with the Black Lives Matter movement, a huge movement, which again threw up whole new layers of activists. And so one of our challenges this year is to continue, alongside building People for Profit, is to build and deepen the work we've done around Stand Up to Racism. And again, 2 dates here, because we're not just about discussion, we are about intervening to try to shape events and to organise. The one is on the 27th of February is the Stand Up to Racism Trade Union Conference, which will of course be online. It's an opportunity to draw trade unionists together to raise questions about how we mobilise against racism and how we take up questions of institutionalised racism in workplaces. It's backed by the TUC. This means you have an excuse to talk to any trade union branch about this conference. It's an open door. So we need to build that. And then on the 20th of March, which is around UN Anti-Racism Day, where we've always had an annual anti-racist demonstration, which proved incredibly important and increasingly an international event, including in the United States, more important than ever. Of course, it's a different situation this year. And we are looking at holding local events. There may be something in central London, but it's going to be much more about local events. And that means thinking about that in Norwich and elsewhere in Norfolk. So that would be something we need to discuss tonight, perhaps, and where plans are around that. Just say one other thing. We're building united fronts like Stand Up to Racism and People for Profit, where the SWP works with wider forces, is crucial. But within that, we also want to find an audience and to draw new layers of people to revolutionary socialist politics. So one of our tasks, one of our tests for the organisation, in a sense the conference was an opportunity to assess how we're progressing on this, is not just are we deepening Stand Up to Racism, but are we expanding, recruiting new layers of people from our anti-racist work into the revolution, and developing a new cadre, especially a new young black cadre around Marxist politics about questions of racism. And I think we saw some evidence of that process. You think about, say, the pamphlet the party produced about the debates about privilege theory. There's a very interesting and very important, there's a whole new debate about the relationship between racism and capitalism. And in many ways, it's moving the agenda more left with some of these debates, but it's still a debate to engage in. There's an article in the latest International Socialism Journal by Ken Allende, grappling and raising the theoretical level to arm people with arguments about how a strategy for defeating racism. So this is all central to our work. Now, something I haven't touched on, as I sort of come towards an end, is also hugely important. If anything, there was a slight danger we didn't talk about it enough at conference, which is Labour. I mean, Corbyn's the rise of Corbyn, the hundreds of thousands who joined Labour because of Corbyn, was an earthquake. The defeat of Corbynism, undermined by the right, and the pull of unity with the right that often weakened the response of the Corbynite left to the attacks that rained down on it. I don't know if counterquake is a word, but I feel like it might need to be invented. Starmer's attack, having posed a little bit of as a sort of continuity of Corbyn, but also more electoral. Of course, he was a wolf in sheep's clothing, launching attack on attack on the left. I mean, let's remind ourselves, Jeremy Corbyn is still suspended from the Parliamentary Labour Party. That took place was reinstated to membership and then immediately suspended from the Parliament. That's still the case 2 months on. 2 months, I see that Corbyn's talking about going to the High Court. To me, that reflects the weakness of the left in terms of its ability to fight back. And Starmer, who should be having the government on the rack over its criminal negligence and failures. I mean, people saw Johnson today, I think it's today in Parliament, could land a blow on Starmer by saying Marcus Rashford, the footballer, is doing a far more effective job of holding the government to account than Sir Keir Starmer. And the truth is, people know that's true. That's true. And I suppose the point I want to just emphasize here is what this means is I think there's a large layer of people, tens of thousands, maybe it's hundreds of thousands, who are reassessing their political energies, their political position, their political home, about whether they should stay in the Labour Party. Some have left, many have left, at least 50,000, maybe more by now. Some of them perhaps just retreating in despair about the hopelessness. Others, I think, saying what we need is to get involved in campaigns, in our union branches, which is fantastic. But we have to have a debate with as many of those people as possible about why they also need to join the SWP. We need to start thinking about identifying people. We need to be discussing them. We need to be winning them. And we can win people, we can win an audience. And I think we win people's respect through our activism, through our attempts to take initiatives and respond to the multiple crises we're facing. But we also need to put an argument about why it's not good enough just to be an individual activist in the struggle, that you are more effective if you're in a collective socialist organisation that takes initiatives, not just as individuals, but collectively, and then can punch much above its weight to shape events. I mean, I was just thinking about this today. Look at the US. Look at what happened at the Capitol last week. you have a situation that screams out for an initiative to launch a serious anti-fascist organisation, much like we did with the Anti-Nazi League or UAF in Britain or KIRFA in Greece. There are tens of thousands of socialists, many of them in organisations like the Democratic Socialists of America. There are huge numbers of Black Lives Matter activists. And yet there's a missing link of socialist organisation that can take initiatives. I mean, our small group of co-thinkers, we're talking a few dozen in a country of 360 million, but based in New York, was able to call a demonstration to counter the attempted Proud Boys march in New York City on Sunday, which got hundreds out, and the Proud Boys cried off and didn't turn up. You know, if an organisation that was the size of the SWP existed in America, think what we could do. And that's why collective organisation, not just individual socialists, it so matters. And we have to put these arguments to people. I think the last point I want to make, so he says, finding his notes, it's just about the Socialist Workers' Party itself. And I think we have to raise our sights. I think that means that we have to start from, as we have, and I think with some important gains this year in East Anglia around, as I said, united front activity, working with others, seeking to mobilise wider forces on key questions of austerity, safety, racism, and so on. I think all of that requires, and in some ways we're fighting on more fronts than before, tight organisation, a branch committee that's focused on the task of taking what we're doing nationally and looking how that fits locally. We need to constantly think about attractive political meetings with good speakers, well advertised and so on. And we have to think about our audience and trying to attract people both online and through, old school texting, phone calls and so on. And we have to constantly fight, and this is a real danger when we're so restricted, especially at the minute, to online activity a lot more of the time, that we can't just become a kind of club. We constantly have to be a welcoming, friendly place that seeks to work and draw in wider layers of people. And one of the things I think we have to do, and we had a good debate at conference about this, I think the SWP, I think one of the reasons we got off onto the front foot and have been able to make a real difference this year is because we switched online very quickly back in the early days of the lockdown as an organisation. And I think we've made huge advances at every level. We're looking to create and throw resources and concentrate resources into a new integrated website, which will mean that Socialist Review is no longer published in the physical form, but a new website will precisely carry the kind of longer reads and more in-depth analysis, hopefully on a more rapid turnaround basis as well, and that we try and make it one of the key websites for a much wider section of the left to be drawn around our ideas with more video and so on and content. That's an exciting development in the next few months. But I also think we have to constantly think about the local social media strategy for branches, who's responsible for tweeting, not just leaving comrades to do it, talking to comrades. Often new members might want to take up these things, but we also have to talk about the political content and discuss these things and have a kind of, a plan of action around all of these things. The key thing I just want to end there for, I think that if the SWP continues to try to work with wider forces, but also supplies a political clarity, has a real engagement with people who are reassessing in the wake of the defeat of the Corbyn project. Left reformism is in crisis. There are existential questions about the very future of human society. The SWP, I think, has been growing. I think we felt that at conference, but it can make another big step forward in the next few months and strengthen the forces of revolutionary socialism that can help speed the process of settling accounts with this rotten system that so desperately needs to be swept aside. Thanks, Wendy.